It's time now for the news review of this bulletin. Britain reportedly plans to increase the number of its stockpiled nuclear warheads for the first time since the end of the Cold War. A report by The Guardian says a review of defense and foreign policy would see an increase of the number of warheads, which currently stands at 180. The review is set to be released next week. The last defense review in 2015 committed the UK to reducing the numbers of operationally available warheads to 120. The increase is set to be aimed at persuading the U.S. to co-fund a replacement for UK nuclear weapons, also known as the Trident nuclear program. Britain has been heavily dependent on U.S. technology to operate its nuclear weapons in the past 60 years. Marcus Papadopoulos, historian, journalist, and author, joins us from London. We also have Rodney Shakespeare, who's a commentator and professor of economics, also joining us from London. Welcome. Marcus Papadopoulos, first over to you. The Trident nuclear system that the UK has, basically it is said that it's really owned by the U.S. Does that mean that the operational capacity is also by the U.S., then in turn decisions that are made on it are also influenced at a minimum by the U.S.?
Well, successive British governments have long argued that Britain has an independent nuclear deterrent system. In practice, however, Britain can only use its nuclear deterrent against a foe with American permission. So that actuality really does undermine the arguments of the British state that the UK has an independent nuclear deterrent. But I think there is another angle to this story which I would like to explore. The willful omission of British mainstream media, both broadcast and print, to scrutinise the decision of the British government to expand its stockpile of nuclear warheads, and the complete absence by British mainstream media to devote sufficient coverage to this development really does serve as a timely reminder to the British people that the UK has neither a free nor independent press. Why do I say that? Because over the last year, nearly 1 million Britons have lost their jobs because of the numerous lockdowns which have been imposed on the British population by the British government. That, together with a long-term existing problem in Britain, namely poverty, in which today in the UK, 14 million Britons live in poverty. 4 million British children live below the breadline. Yet, the British government finds the money when it laments at apparently not having sufficient money because of the impact of what is known as COVID-19. Nonetheless, the British government finds the money to increase its nuclear deterrent. Despite all of that, British mainstream media is silent on the matter. The British media, if British media was actually both independent and free, would ask the British government, would ask 10 Downing Street why it is that the British government claims not to have sufficient money, for example, for the health service or for the education system or to tackle poverty, but has money, and we're talking about hundreds of millions of pounds, to expand Britain's nuclear arsenal. So in my opinion, that is the main highlight of the decision of the British government to expand the UK's nuclear stockpile.
Okay, well, Rodney Shakespeare, what do you think? I mean, we're looking at the fact that you have the UK that is following the US's lead when it comes to matters of worldwide concern in their eyes. And one of the things is nuclear upgrades, of which the U.S. also is planning to go ahead with what was in the news with Biden's $100 billion renovation or upgrades of its nuclear arsenal. I mean, does this make sense for countries who are advocating against that while they themselves are actually upgrading it? Of course, Iran being one of the victims of their double standard strategy or posturing when it comes to countries like Iran?
I would remind viewers of the consequences of nuclear radiation. The 1986 Chernobyl Soviet-Ukraine accident resulted in effects thousands of miles away in the UK, where 9,000 farms were affected. Fukushima is still spewing out radiation, and in Iraq, depleted uranium results in deformed children to this day. But there's the bigger issue on top of that. These weapons, by the way, are 6 times more powerful than the one at Hiroshima in the Second World War. But the bigger issue is, when all else fails, they go to war. And the alternative economists and conventional economists are anticipating some form of global economic collapse. And at this moment, what's happening? They're pushing more and more for war with China, with the UK and France going along with the USA. And all the time, there's that rabid attack dog called Zionist Israel, which is always on the verge of war. And nobody ever mentions that Israel has somewhere between, 200, 300 nuclear weapons and is an out-of-control, aggressive entity. That's how serious the situation is, and we are making it worse.
Finally, Marcus Papadopoulos, you have this thing by the Five Eyes, of which the UK is part of it, along with the US, and again, as part of the security arrangement that they have. Are we looking at any type of posturing that's taking place with this type of upgrades, also that the US is undertaking, that would be directed towards China and Russia, perhaps?
I would say yes. That is my short answer to your question. I believe that the main target of Britain's decision to increase its nuclear stockpile is Russia. But then we have to explore that deeper. Why is it that the British government is alleging that there is a threat to British national security and a threat to the security of Europe from the Russian Federation? The British government, like the American government, which also makes the same allegation, seldomly corroborates that very serious allegation. The reality is that there is no threat emanating from Russia against either Britain, America, or Europe. The reality is the other way. It is not Russia which has a military alliance of its own on the borders of Britain. It is a Western military bloc in the name of NATO which has a presence on the borders of Russia, a presence which is growing year on year. And when we hear British politicians and British mainstream journalists talking of a Russian threat, they know that in order to justify an increase in the defense budget and in the nuclear weapons budget, there has to be an enemy. If there is no enemy, then there can be no justification for increasing the nuclear stockpile of the UK. So Russia is a very useful country for the British establishment to cite as a reason for increasing Britain's conventional capabilities and Britain's nuclear capabilities. If you press a British minister or a British mainstream journalist to explain in detail precisely what the Russian threat is, then they will struggle, and in fact many of them will have a gumless look on their faces. As I said, there is no Russian-led military bloc on America's border or on Britain's border, but there is a Western military bloc on Russia's border. It is the Americans and the British who are looking to foment political instability in Russia through people such as Alexei Navalny. So Russia is most certainly threatened by Western global supremacy and the sense of Western superiority, but there is no threat from Russia to the Western world. Russia is seeking to defend its national security.
Thank you very much for that. Marcus Papadopoulos, historian, journalist, and author. Also like to thank Rodney Shakespeare, commentator and professor of economics.